So I'd like to cover a couple of things just before we start writing code. First of all, there's a method on class called ForName. And ForName allows us to load classes based on the class name. By default, ForName takes the name of the class and a Boolean parameter specifying whether to define that class or not. But there's a 3-parameter version of class.ForName. There's a third parameter takes a class loader. And class.ForName then uses that class loader to load the class. So it looks something like this. We create, for example, here a new URL class loader, call it UCL, call class.ForName, passing the name of the class, and then as the third parameter, passing UCL. In this case, the class is loaded by the class loader defined using the URL class loader we created, not the application class loader that was loaded when the application started up. This makes it slightly easier to use class loaders and provides some isolation. So something else we've mentioned, and something I'd like to emphasize, is the idea of using interfaces in our code, or using base classes to allow us to make calls on classes that we load. So for example here, we're using class.ForName to load a rocket class, and we're passing this thing a class loader. The UCL is a reference to a URL class loader. But when we call new instance, we cast this to be of type rocket. But rocket here, the type rocket, is visible to the applications class loader, and that really defeats the purpose of using the URL class loader to load the class in the first place. Instead, we do what we've already done in our demos. We still use the URL class loader to load the class rocket, but now when we call new instance, we cast this to be of type rocket interface. So rocket interface is visible to the applications class loader delegation, but rocket is only visible to the URL class loader's delegation. So we could load rocket using one URL class loader and cast it to be of type rocket interface. We could then load another copy of rocket, a different version, using a different URL class loader, but cast it to the same rocket interface. So we did a previous demonstration where we use a URL class loader to load a class file. This code is similar, except here we're using class.ForName and we're passing the URL class loader as the third parameter to class.ForName. So in this case, com.pluralsight.quote will be loaded as a class from the location specified in the URL class loader, which is simply demos, class loading with ITF, out artifacts, implementations _jar, implementations.jar. If I take this code and duplicate it, but just change the name, so we have URL2 rather than URL1 and class loader 2, but we still do class.ForName, we keep all the locations the same, so we're still loading from implementations.jar for both URLs. I can create an instance here of using class 1, and I can create an instance using class 2. And these are both cast to be of type iQuote. And we know that quote com.pluralsight.quote indeed implements iQuote. And then at the end here, I'll print out 2 checks. I check to see if something of type class 1 is equal to class 2. And then I also call quote 1.getClass and quote 2.getClass and check to see if they are the same. So at the command prompt, if I run this code, so again just pointing my application class path at the interfaces jar file and the location out to production client where the main classes are held, and then run com.mantizo.main, we see that class 1 is equal to class 2 is false, and quote 1.class is equal to quote 2.class is false. So here, class 1 and class 2 are not the same. So the class loaded here and the class loaded here are not the same, which is sort of unusual, as we said that when we create a class, that class should be cached by the class loader. So in this case, we might expect class 1 to be the same as class 2, i.e. when we call class.ForName here, we'd expect the same class instance to be returned into class 1 and class 2. But as we're using different class loader delegations, that's not the case. So here, our URL class loader created on this line will load class 2, and the URL class loader created on this line will load class 1. So they can't be the same. And the same for the calls here. It's the same for the second check. When we check to see if quote 1.getClass is the same as quote 2.getClass, quote 1.getClass returns class 1, and quote 2.getClass returns class 2. So we'd expect to see the same result. So using this technique, we get a degree of isolation. So the class is loaded by this class loader delegation here, using one URL class loader, can be different to the classes loaded by this delegation here, loaded by a second URL class loader. So that lets us load classes in isolation, and therefore to load different versions of the same class at runtime.